Or you have a set of 114 uncreated, eternal divine objects who are mindless, and you have the audacity to attack the Trinity?
Nobody has ever come up with the interpretation. I don't know how he dreamed this up. Maybe he was just, I don't know, on an acid trip in his mother's basement one day, or in his mother's kitchen. I don't know which one, but it's ridiculous. He doesn't have anything from our tradition that supports that, not Sammy's incoherent babbling, which I've already refuted. Today I have a very exciting episode for you guys. We have to debunk some of the absolutely ridiculous, insane, garbage arguments that Mr. Shamoun perpetrated recently on the Fresh and Fit podcast. If we can even call it a debate when the Christian opponents are using such ridiculous argumentation as you're about to see, I don't know if we can really call it a debate when that's happening. But nevertheless, let's take a look at what very recently, for some strange reason, many Christians are putting forward Sam Shamoun as like the great Christian debater. He's going to destroy all Muslims and Islam, and nobody can respond to his arguments. Really, and he's been preparing for so long, and he came with these ridiculous arguments that you're about to see, which I'll refute in just a couple minutes and show you how absurd they really are. So let's take a listen.
When he says he believes in Tawheed, what exactly does it mean for Allah to be one? Because I'm aware that Daniel does believe the fact that the Quran is uncreated. Therefore, we now have two distinct eternal entities that are not identical. Why? Because I'm going to show Daniel from his authentic sources, Sahih narration.
So there you have it in the beginning. He says that Muslims believe that the Quran is eternal and uncreated. Now, as we'll see, the meaning by which Sam understands that, Muslims do not believe in this separate and distinct, eternal, physical Quran that exists outside of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that is maybe, I don't know how he imagines it, like a tablet or a book that is eternal and floating in space that has the verses and surahs of the Quran written upon it. No Orthodox Sunni Muslim believes this and has ever believed this. But that's the way that he's presenting himself and what he intends to mean when, oh, Muslims believe in this distinct entity, which is the Quran, which exists outside of Allah, which is uncreated and eternal. Nobody believes in that at all, Sammy boy. So let me show you what actual Orthodox Sunni Muslims believe about this. So let me show you that, and I'm going to read a quote from Ibn Taymiyyah here. Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah said, and I quote, "The early generation said, the Quran is the word of Allah that was revealed and is not created." So correct, we believe the Quran is the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it is not created. And they said that he speaks when he wills. Then they explained, meaning the Salaf, that the words of Allah are eternal. Meaning, what do they mean by eternal? The words of Allah being eternal? Meaning that the divine attribute of speech, the divine attribute of kalam is eternal. Which means Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has the eternal attribute of kalam, that meaning that he can speak whenever he wills. Now, he clarifies further. Not one of them, meaning not one of the Salaf, said that any particular words of his are eternal. And not one of them said that the Quran is eternal. So we don't believe in a separate and distinct Quran outside of Allah that is uncreated and eternal, floating around in space somewhere in orbit. I don't know what Sam imagines. Nor do we believe that any particular words of the Quran, including the surahs and the ayat that compose them, are eternal in the way that Sam imagines. Rather, they said, meaning the Salaf said, that the Quran is the word of Allah, it was revealed and is not created. As Allah uttered the Quran by His will, the Quran is His word, and it was revealed from Him and not created. Yet despite that it is not eternal as Allah is eternal, even though Allah has the attribute of speech and speaks whenever He wills, so the attribute of speech is eternal. So what do Muslims actually believe about the Quran? They believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala eternally had this attribute of kalam, which is his ability to speak whenever he wills. At a particular moment in time, he quite literally spoke the Quran and spoke it and revealed it to Jibreel or Gabriel, the angel Gabriel, alayhi salam, and then that was carried down and revealed to the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. We don't believe in an eternal floating Quran, and nor do we believe that any of the individual surahs or words of the Quran are eternal in the way that Sam imagines. Okay? But because Allah's attribute of kalam or speech is eternal and uncreated, and any one of his acts of speech, which is the Quran is by his will, which means it's an act of his speech, that act of speech of the Quran is uncreated. Simple. Sam, so the rest of your argument, which is going to follow, which we'll see, doesn't even apply to Orthodox Sunni Muslims. But anyway, let's carry on and we'll listen to see what Sam actually has to say when he brings up these different ahadith.
Sahih narration that the Quran and the chapters of the Quran actually will intercede and debate with Allah. So now we have a paradox, because if the Quran is the speech of Allah and that's Allah speaking, is Allah speaking to himself? So is Daniel actually a modalist, or is he a polytheist, or does he have a form of a trinity? But his is even worse, because it's not three persons, because each chapter of the Quran has the potentiality of speaking with Allah. So that means his God consists of at least 115 divine persons or divine beings who can interact with one another and appear separately. And this is all from his authentic narration.
So what narrations is Sam speaking about? He's speaking about, because he doesn't really list them very clearly, he's speaking about narrations that mention the Quran supposedly, quote unquote, interceding for human beings on Judgment Day or the end times, etc., etc. Now, let's see what our scholars in our tradition actually say about this hadith and these different ahadith. Do they interpret it as Sam, as thinking that the Quran has a mind of its own and it's going to be speaking on behalf of human beings, and because it's, supposedly, as we already debunked, uncreated and eternal in the way that Sam imagines as this floating Quran in orbit somewhere in space, he thinks that, oh, therefore this is, like a contradiction, because we have this uncreated eternal Quran that is speaking, so we have another divine being that has a mind of its own. No, we don't believe in the polytheism that Christians believe in, where the Father and Son actually speak to each other, are both supposedly God and fully God and distinct from each other, and yet there's only one God. No, that's two gods. Sorry to tell you. So let's see what this narration actually is and what our scholars actually say about it. So this is from Imam Ahmed. And I got this reference, which I was actually looking for because I was aware of it, but it was posted on Twitter by a good brother, so I wanted to just mention and give credit to him. And this is a screenshot here, which very clearly demonstrates how our scholars authentically interpreted this hadith. So it says, they said, and this talk about Imam Ahmed now saying, they said, the following hadith was narrated. Verily the Quran will come on the day of resurrection as a pale young man. Then he will go to his owner, i.e. the one who recited, and say, do you recognize me? So he will say, who are you? So he will say, I am the Quran. I made you thirsty in the day and made you stay up late at night. He, i.e. the Jahmi, said, so Allah will bring it, and the Jahmiya are basically a heretical sect, not too important for now. So Allah will bring it, i.e. bring the Quran, and it will say, O Lord. So based on these ahadith, they claimed, meaning the Jahmiya claimed, so in actuality, and we'll see, the Jahmiya actually used these ahadith to actually argue that the Quran is created and is not uncreated. Whereas Sammy Boy is using these hadith to argue that the Quran is created and yet has a mind of its own talking. So even the heretical Jahmiya didn't come up with this ridiculous of an argument. But anyway, then Imam Ahmed says, so based upon these ahadith, they claim the Quran is created, which we don't believe that it is. So we said to them, what do the scholars of the Quran and Sunnah actually say? The authentic scholars, not Sammy Shamoun making up this nonsense in his mother's kitchen. So we said to them, the Quran will not come except with the meaning what does this mean? Which verily was narrated. Whoever recites the surah, Qul huwallahu ahad, meaning say He Allah is one, then he will have such and such reward. Do you not see that the one who recites Qul huwallahu ahad, then nothing will come to him except the reward of reciting it. So what does it mean that the Quran is coming as an intercessor? It's referring to the deeds and rewards that are received from the person who recited the Quran. Not this ridiculous understanding of the Quran having a mind of its own and speaking on our behalf to the extent that it's another separate and distinct divine entity as Sam imagines it. No, the Hadith refers to the rewards of us reciting while on earth, coming to intercede on our behalf so that we will be judged favorably by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Does this sound anything like the nonsense that Sam is spewing? No, but we'll continue further. Because we recite the Quran and it is the reward for it that says, O Lord, because the speech of Allah does not come, nor does it change from one form into another, i.e. into a young man, as mentioned in the Hadith. Verily, the meaning of that the Quran will come is verily that the reward of reciting will come and say, O Lord. So what does it mean that the Quran is going to come and intercede for us? It's the reward for the believers' recitation of the Quran. Very clear, very simple. This is the explanation of Imam Ahmed. Now, furthermore, how do we know this? There's another hadith which is actually reported by and recorded by Imam Ahmed, right, in his Musnad, where it is even clearer to us what is this talking about. So, the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, fasting and the Quran will intercede for the servant on the day of resurrection. So this is another hadith which is saying not only the Quran will recede, but fasting will recede. So what does this mean, Sam? That fasting is another eternal, uncreated, divine entity which intercedes for us and comes and speaks? No, of course not. We'll see what the hadith says. Fasting will say, how does fasting speak, which is something which is abstract and not something which is concrete in the way that Sam imagines? Fasting will say, O Lord, I prevented him from food and desires during the day, so let me intercede from him. The Quran will say, O Lord, I prevented him from sleeping during the night, so let me intercede for him. Thus they will both intercede for him. So the Quran interceding for humans, believers, on the day of resurrection is the equivalent to the fasting interceding for us. Does Sam imagine that there's this entity called fasting in the way that he understands the other hadith about the Quran? No, of course not. So this is again with the understanding that our rewards and deeds that the believers did while on earth for not only the reciting the Quran, but also for fasting will intercede in favor of the believers on the day of resurrection. It's very clear. We see it from this hadith. We see it from the interpretations of our scholars, like Imam Ahmed and the early Salaf, not Sam Shamoun in his mother's kitchen. Furthermore, it's not only Imam Ahmed, it's not only this hadith from the Prophet ﷺ which confirms exactly what I'm saying and refutes Sammy Boy. It's also other early scholars. Does he say what Sam says, or does he agree with Imam Ahmed? Of course he agrees with Imam Ahmed. So Ibn Qutayba says, what was meant by the words Al-Baqarah and Al-Imran, which Sam will go on to later bring up, will come like two clouds, is that their reward will come to the one who read them and will shade him on the day of resurrection, and the reward will come to a man in his grave, and it will come to a man on the day of resurrection and argue in his defense. So this isn't something that we're coming up with thousands of years later. This isn't what Jake is, the Muslim Metaphysician, is coming up with, pulling it out of his backside. This is from our authentic tradition, Sam, which you may not like and you want to try to throw our scholars under the bus, but we're not going to allow for that and accept your ridiculous interpretation. So Ibn Qutayba says very clearly that what is meant by Al-Baqarah and Al-Imran coming like two clouds is that their reward will come to the one who read them and will shade them on the day of resurrection. So we have Imam Ahmed, we have Ibn Qutayba. I can give other scholars and shuyukh from early parts of our tradition which say the exact same thing. And we have another narration in hadith which equates fasting to the Quran, not in terms necessarily of exactly the reward, but in terms of talking about it will intercede. Now, nobody understands fasting as interceding as an entity that's going to speak and all of this nonsense that Sam is understanding as some divine entity. No, it's the rewards of fasting and the rewards of reciting the Quran. So let's carry on, and unfortunately we'll have to listen to the rest of Sammy's ridiculous arguments, but let's take a listen.
Is that according to the Quran, the Spirit of Allah is not Gabriel. So I'm going to now press him in the rebuttal period to prove otherwise. There's not a single verse in the Quran that says the Spirit, the Ruh, is Jibreel. He's now dependent on the very scholars of Islam that come centuries later to bail out Allah and his messenger, because that's what he accused the Lord. The Spirit, according to the Quran, is distinct from Allah. He appears as a man, he speaks and creates. So now if we add the Spirit to the Quran and Allah, he's got about 116 divine persons or beings, and he doesn't have a singular person called Allah. Now coming back to the issue.
So there is his second argument, that there is this thing in the Quran which is mentioned as the Spirit or the Ruh, and the Spirit is not mentioned as Gabriel, but yet it seems to have these divine aspects about it. So now you have another divine entity, which is the Spirit, which is distinct from Allah. So you can't attack us and our Trinity for polytheism because you believe in distinct divine entities, and the Spirit is nowhere in the Quran identified as Gabriel, which I'm about to show you that it is. And then he says you have to rely on later scholars in order for that. I'll show you why Sam is such a hypocrite, because Jay mentions the scholars in his tradition in just a second. But let's take a look at whether or not the Quran identifies the Spirit and who is the Spirit actually according to the Quran. Here's the first verse of the Quran I want to take a look at, which is chapter 26, verse 192. And it says, "And indeed it," referring to the Quran, "is the revelation of the Lord of the worlds." 26, 193. "The trustworthy Spirit," and it has in parentheses, but let's leave that aside for now. "The trustworthy Spirit has brought it down." So the Spirit is the one who brought down the Quran, very clearly. Okay? I don't think Sam will dispute that, and if he does, then he's more stupid than we actually thought. But now let's go to another verse of the Quran, which mentions in chapter 16, verses 101 and 102. And when we substitute a verse in place of another verse, and Allah is most knowing of what he sends down, then they say to you, O Muhammad, are but an inventor of lies, but most of them do not know. Say, O Muhammad, the pure Spirit, again referring to Jibreel, but that's in parentheses, it doesn't say that in the verse, this pure Spirit has brought it down from your Lord in truth to make firm those who believe and as a guidance and good tidings to the Muslims. So who is the one that brings down the Quran? The pure Spirit, the trustworthy Spirit? Okay, but who is the trustworthy Spirit? How do we identify him? Is it Gabriel or this other divine entity, as Sammy Boy wants to claim? In the Quran, chapter 2, verse 97 and 98, it says, "Say, whoever is an enemy to Gabriel or Jibreel alayhi salam," and that is in the text, "it is none but he who has brought it," i.e. the Quran, "down upon your heart, O Muhammad, by the permission of Allah, confirming that which was before it and a guidance and good tidings for the believers." Wait a second. So we saw before that the pure Spirit and the trustworthy Spirit is the one who brought down the Quran. But then this verse in Surah Al-Baqarah, chapter 2, verse 97, it says, the one who has brought down the Quran upon the Prophet, peace be upon him's heart, is Jibreel. So if the Spirit is the one who did it, and the Quran says in another ayah that Jibreel alayhi salam is the one who did it, then that means that Jibreel alayhi salam is the Spirit. Unless you believe that there are two distinct entities, the Spirit is one entity, and Jibreel alayhi salam is another entity, and both of them are bringing down the Quran onto the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. Well, that wouldn't make any sense, because if one of them is doing it, that's sufficient. Why would you need the Spirit and Jibreel? So of course, the fact that Jibreel alayhi salam is mentioned as the one who brings down revelation, and that is our tradition, not only for the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, but other previous prophets, that the one who brings down the revelation in this verse is Jibreel, and the Spirit does that. Therefore, the simplest explanation is that the Spirit actually is Jibreel alayhi salam, and this is how our tradition understood it. Nobody, I challenge Sammy Boy to bring a single reputable scholar from the Sunni perspective that ever actually made the claim that the spirit is this other divine entity who has divine qualities or is uncreated and eternal, who speaks and creates on behalf of Allah, who actually is the one who does these things. Bring me a Sunni scholar from our early tradition that actually says this. You can't. So why should we trust your ridiculous interpretation in your mother's kitchen when we have clearly what the Quran says and then what also our scholarly tradition actually says? Now, should Sam have a problem appealing to scholarly interpretations of our early tradition? No, because he does it all the time for his verses of the Bible. And not only that, Sam also uses, and many Christians make similar arguments, they take verses which they say apply to Yahweh in the Old Testament, then they say that verses like that are used to apply to Jesus, and then they say, well, then that means that Jesus must be Yahweh. Well, that's the same argument that is being used here. Because if you, and I'm not saying that I agree with their interpretation of those texts, but I'm saying if he thinks that's a valid way of arguing, then what I'm doing is I'm taking texts that refer to the Holy Spirit or the Spirit, then I'm taking texts which refer to Jibreel alayhi salam, which they're identical, referring to the same thing, and therefore I'm saying that Jibreel alayhi salam is the Spirit. So wait, if you can do that with verses that supposedly refer to Yahweh, which then in the New Testament refer to Jesus, then you can't say that this is an invalid form of argumentation, Sam. And you cannot argue and say that, oh, we have to rely on scholars. What is the problem with referring to scholarly interpretation in our tradition, especially given the fact that your own partner during the debate, Jay Dyer, uses this same argument and excuse when trying to argue with Brother Ijaz. We can accept our scholarly interpretations from our tradition. Why do we need to accept your incoherent babbling in your mother's kitchen over the scholarly interpretation from our tradition? Are you kidding me? You're a hypocrite, you're a fool. Anyway, let's continue further to listen to more of Sam's incoherent babbling, where he says pretty much more of the same.
Maybe you didn't hear what I said. The Quran must have a mind independent from your God if the Quran is going to argue with your God and the individual chapters. Here, Sahih Muslim, book 4, number 1757. Abu Umama said he heard Allah's messenger say, recite the Quran, for on the day of resurrection, it will come as an intercessor for those who recite it. How does the speech of Allah intercede with Allah if it's a speech of Allah? Is Allah speaking to himself in a different mode? Then you are a modalist. So your tawheed is modalism. But then it gets worse for you. Recite the two bright ones, Al-Baqarah and Surah Imran.
As I already explained from the other hadith, that fasting also intercedes, which is not an entity that's talking and has its own concrete existence and is eternal and uncreated and a divine entity as Sam imagines. No, that hadith shows that the recitation of the Quran and the deeds, as we already showed as well from interpretations of Imam Ahmed and Ibn Qutaybah, that explicitly say it is the rewards and the deeds that benefit the Muslims and the believers who actually recited and fasted for that benefit on the day of resurrection. Not your nonsense, Sam.
2 and 3. For on the day of resurrection, they will come as two clouds or two shades or two flocks of birds in ranks, pleading for those who recite them. Pleading with who? Themselves? If the surahs of the Quran can appear independently, separately, and appear in visible form, and argue with Allah, that's either your God being schizophrenic, arguing with himself in different modes, so you're a modalist, or you have now separate gods arguing with one another, so you're a polytheist, or you have to believe that Tawheed encompasses a plurality of distinct entities who can then interact and argue with one another. So don't run and evade with your smoke and mirror tactics. Deal with the issue. The surahs are supposed to be uncreated and eternal.
The surahs are supposed to be uncreated and eternal? So the Arabic surahs of the Quran are supposed to be uncreated and eternal in the way that Sam imagines this as like this separate, distinct, divine, floating Quran. No Muslim Sunni scholar worth anything has ever said something like that. And as I explained already from the quote earlier from Ibn Taymiyyah, what our position on this actually is.
But the dilemma that the chapters of the Quran, uncreated, eternal, will be speaking with God. So you have uncreated entities unlike your hands and feet. So I'm going to now agree with you. Your Quran is a mindless entity who will appear to Allah without a mind, arguing with Allah. So you're left with a mindless entity interacting with your God. So either that means your God is speaking through different modes, or you have a set of 114 uncreated, eternal divine objects who are mindless, and you have the audacity to attack the Trinity?
We have the audacity to attack the Trinity because, yes, Muslims are claiming that we believe in all these 116 divine entities and that are uncreated and eternal, like the Spirit and the 114 verses of the Quran plus Allah. Astaghfirullah. Nobody has ever come up with the interpretation. I don't know how he dreamed this up in his, maybe he was just, I don't know, on an acid trip in his mother's basement one day, or in his mother's kitchen. I don't know which one, but it's ridiculous. He doesn't have anything from our tradition that supports that in terms of scholarly interpretation. However, when we try to critique them, we should attempt to come with actual interpretations and internal critiques that are based on what their tradition says, not Sammy's incoherent babbling, which I've already refuted. With that being said, guys, I hope that you enjoyed this video and found it educational. If you did, consider subscribing and liking the channel and commenting on it. And also, if you want to go above and beyond and support the channel, then the best way to do so is at the GoFundMe link, which is pinned in the comment section of this video, as well as the description section of the video. Also, I want to give a quick shout out to brother Fareed from Fareed Responds. He had a brilliant video that came out that I want to recommend that you guys go and check out, which will also be in the description of this video, where he is refuting the nonsense that came from the second portion of this debate on Fresh and Fit with Sam and Jay, where they try to bring up examples about the ahruf of the Quran and also examples about preservation. Check that out. But until next time, guys, inshallah, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.